At 6:55 on Christmas Eve, I was wearing the apron my sister had handed me when the first of her VIP guests stepped through Dad's front door. He looked at me, stopped cold, and asked Dad, "Excuse me, why is she standing here?" My sister laughed too quickly and pulled him toward the living room. I thought he had mistaken me for someone else. Then, later that night, he mentioned my dead mother and a question she had asked him 3 years ago. By midnight, I knew the apron was the least disturbing thing in that house. Before I tell you how we got there, stay with me, because what I found in Dad's house that Christmas changed the way I understood my family. I had not spent a full Christmas week at Dad's house since Mom died. I had stopped by for dinner and dropped off gifts, but I always found a reason to leave before the house settled around me. 3 years had not changed the furnace knocking beneath the kitchen floor, or the faint cedar smell in the front hallway. What had changed was the ownership of everything. Vanessa had arrived 2 days before me and made Dad's house look like a temporary headquarters for her life. Her laptop sat open at one end of the dining table beneath a vase of white roses. Printed guest lists were tucked beside Christmas cards. Boxes from a caterer filled half the refrigerator. Even the tree looked different. Mom had always used mismatched ornaments collected over decades. Vanessa had pushed most of them toward the back and tied ivory ribbon through the branches. Dad hugged me at the door, warm enough to make me feel guilty for noticing any of it. He was 66 now, thinner since Mom died, his gray hair clipped shorter than she would have liked. He took my bag, asked about traffic, and before I had my coat off said, "Could you help me with the folding table in the basement? Vanessa needs it for the drink station." That was how things worked between us. Vanessa planned. Dad adjusted the world around her plan. I was asked to carry something. None of it was serious enough to protest, which was probably why it had lasted so long. I told myself I was 32 and perfectly capable of moving a table without turning it into a family referendum. I had come for Christmas. I wanted 4 quiet days and one holiday that did not end with somebody saying Mom's name and then going silent. Vanessa swept through the kitchen while Dad and I wrestled the table around a corner. She was 5 years older than me and had always possessed the confidence of someone who believed a room improved when she entered it. At 37, she had turned that confidence into a career. She handled partnerships and expansion for CarePath Alliance, a nonprofit that helped families navigate elder care services. Dad loved telling people that Vanessa helped families when they did not know where to turn. I never argued. Maybe she did. After Mom died, I had stayed so far from the elder care world that I knew more about Vanessa's work from Dad's proud summaries than from Vanessa herself. Now she was organizing a Christmas gathering at the house for donors and professional contacts, and every surface carried evidence of it. Place cards, menus, seating notes, catering lists. She called the party important but relaxed, which was Vanessa. Language for important enough that everyone else was expected to relax on command. The next morning, Dad asked me to clear a cabinet in the den so he could find Mom's old silver serving pieces. The cabinet had become a resting place for things none of us had decided what to do with. Appliance manuals, loose batteries, a bag of birthday candles, Mom's reading glasses in a red case. Beneath a stack of old mail sat a dark blue spiral notebook with a bent plastic cover. I knew it before I touched it. For almost a year, that notebook had lived on the corner of Mom's kitchen counter. I had written medication times in it, appointment questions, which foods she could tolerate, which nurse had returned a call. Dad handled bills, contracts, and vendor paperwork. I handled what happened to Mom's body between sunrise and midnight. For one sharp second, I was back at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, listening to Mom insist that lime gelatin was a crime against nature while I tried to get 3 spoonfuls into her. She had been exhausted and in pain, but she still glared at the cup and said, "If I survive this, I'm suing whoever made green a flavor." I laughed because I was tired, and she laughed with me until the laugh turned into a cough. That was the part of caring for her I almost never talked about. People remembered hospitals and terrible phone calls. I remembered the stupid jokes and the way she would still straighten my collar before an appointment, as if I were the one who needed looking after. I closed the notebook without opening it. After Mom died, I had decided silence could be a kind of kindness. If I did not list what I had done for her, nobody had to list what they had not done. If I did not argue about who had been present, Mom's last year could stay hers instead of becoming evidence in a family scorecard. I put the notebook on the shelf and reached for the next box. A Christmas card slipped out from between two old booklets and fell face down on the carpet. It was small and cream-colored, with a watercolor sprig of holly on the front. The envelope had Mom's name written by hand. I should have put it back. Instead, I opened it, partly because grief teaches you to treat handwriting like a voice recording. Beneath a short Christmas greeting, someone had written one sentence that did not belong with the rest. "You were right about the referrals. I wish we'd listened sooner." The card was signed only M.R. I read it twice. Referrals could mean anything. During Mom's illness, there had been more names, phone numbers, services, and scheduling windows than I could count. Still, the line bothered me because it sounded like the end of a conversation I had never heard. "Dad?" I asked. He looked up. What referrals was Mom asking people about? His face changed so slightly I might have missed it if I had not spent most of my childhood learning when he wanted a subject to disappear. His eyes dropped to the card. "Where did you get that?" I told him it had fallen out, and asked who MR was. "I don't remember." When I pressed him, how could he not remember someone writing Mom that she had been right about something? Dad sat back on his heels. "Aaron, your mother was worried about everything near the end. She was sick. She was tired. There were days when every decision felt dangerous to her." I told him that was not what I had asked. "I know. I'm saying don't read too much into an old Christmas card." He took it, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the notebook. The speed of the movement bothered me more than his answer. Dad had not looked puzzled. He had looked prepared. I let it go because that was still what I knew how to do. By lunchtime, Vanessa was in the dining room on a call, talking about families who need a trustworthy path through impossible choices. I heard CarePath Alliance again, and felt a faint tug of recognition I could not place. During Mom's illness, Dad had dealt with contracts while I tracked pills, nausea, appointments, meals, and sleep. I remembered logos less clearly. Then I remembered the shape of Mom's hands. CarePath might have been on a brochure or invoice. Or maybe I had only heard Vanessa say it so often since. When her call ended, I asked, "Was CarePath around when Mom was sick?" Vanessa's fingers paused over her keyboard. "Of course it was around. Organizations like ours have been around for years." I asked whether Mom had ever had a problem with referrals. Her expression tightened. "Please don't turn Christmas into Mom again." I said nothing. Vanessa returned to her screen, and Dad, standing at the sink behind me, began rinsing a glass that was already clean. That night, after the house went quiet, I returned to the den. I told myself I was only putting the card back where it belonged. The notebook was still on the shelf, but the card was inside it now, tucked several pages deep instead of beside it. I opened to the place where Dad had hidden it and saw the signature again. MR. Then my eyes dropped to the opposite page. Halfway down, beside an appointment note in Mom's small slanted handwriting, were the same two initials. MR. I stood in the darkened den with the card in one hand and the notebook in the other, listening to the furnace hum beneath the floor. For the first time in 3 years, I wondered whether Mom had left something unfinished. I slept badly and woke before sunrise, with the initials still in my head. MR was not proof of anything. It was 2 letters on a Christmas card, and 2 letters in a notebook full of handwriting I had not examined in 3 years. I knew enough about grief to understand how badly the mind wanted patterns. It could turn coincidence into meaning, simply because meaning hurt less than randomness. So I did what I had promised myself I would do when I came home. I did not wake Dad. I did not corner Vanessa, and I did not turn Christmas Eve morning into an interrogation. I put the notebook back exactly where I had found it and went downstairs to make coffee. By 8, the house had shifted into party mode. The caterer arrived with insulated boxes. Dad carried folding chairs from the garage. Vanessa moved through the rooms with her phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other, checking names, timing, and where everyone would sit. She asked me to place cards at the dining table because, as she put it, I had the neat handwriting in the family. I almost laughed at the compliment. Vanessa had a talent for making an assignment sound like recognition. The cards were already alphabetized. Most of the names meant nothing to me. Donors, a board member, 2 people from partner organizations. Then I picked up one that read Richard Hale. Something in my chest tightened before I knew why. I had heard that name before. Not recently. It belonged to the strange, exhausted years when Mom was sick, when people from support groups and waiting rooms drifted through my memory without always attaching themselves to clean biographies. There was a small pencil note on the guest sheet beside his name. Anchor Pledge Phase 2 Launch. I was still looking at it when Vanessa reached across the table and took the sheet from under my hand. "Those go on the long table," she said. I told her I knew and asked who Richard was. A donor. When I pointed at the Anchor Pledge note and said it made him sound like more than that, Vanessa's mouth tightened just enough to show I had stepped close to something she considered hers. She explained, in the compressed way people do when they want to appear transparent, without inviting another question, that Richard's commitment was large enough to anchor the next expansion phase. Other donors were more comfortable committing once his pledge was in place. If he held back, the launch schedule would slip. That changed the party in my mind. It was still Christmas Eve, still Dad's house, still candles and wine, and too many white flowers. But it was not merely Vanessa showing off for important people. At least one person walking through the door that night had real power over something she had been working toward for months. I set Richard's card near Dad's place and tried to recover the memory. Hale. A gray coat? A hospital cafeteria? A man pouring bad coffee into a paper cup? The image would not settle. The more I reached for it, the more it dissolved. Vanessa noticed me looking at the seating chart again. "You don't need to sit in here tonight." When I asked what she meant, she clarified that during the reception, I would not be part of the main seating. I reminded her it was Christmas Eve. She called it logistics. Fast food, small plates, not enough room for everyone. There were 12 place cards and 14 chairs. When I looked at the empty chair nearest the wall, she exhaled and told me not to make logistics personal. That phrase could have been stitched onto our family crest. Logistics had always become personal only when I objected to them. I could have challenged her there, but I carried the rest of the place cards to the table. I had decided the night before not to start a war with half a thought and 2 initials, and I was not going to break that decision because Vanessa had found a polished way to tell me I was not part of her guest list. Later, while I was unpacking glassware in the dining room, Vanessa rehearsed part of what she planned to say to the guests. She did not stand at a podium or practice a formal speech. She moved napkins and checked serving trays while talking through her points with Dad, which made it easier to hear without looking as if I was listening. CarePath wanted to expand free navigation services into 2 additional counties. Families would still choose their own providers. The program, Vanessa said, simply helped overwhelmed people find trusted preferred partners faster. The phrase stopped me. Trusted preferred partners. I had seen something close to it before. Not in Vanessa's recent materials, but in the years when Dad handled contracts and vendor forms, while I sat with Mom through medication schedules and nausea. I could not have named the document, but the wording had the dull familiarity of something read while exhausted. I set down a wine glass too hard. Vanessa told me to be careful, and I asked what preferred partner meant. She said it was a provider they knew. "Know how?" I asked. Her patience thinned. You've never cared how CarePath works. I told her that did not mean I could not ask. Dad stepped in with the tone he used whenever a conversation threatened to become inconvenient. Why don't we just get through tonight? You two can talk shop after Christmas. Talk shop, as if that was what I was doing. Vanessa had already turned back to the place settings. The easiest thing would have been to ask her about MR then. Ask whether she remembered Mom questioning referrals. Ask whether preferred partners had anything to do with the card. But I could see the outcome before it happened. Vanessa would hear accusation, where I had only a question. Dad would ask us to stop upsetting each other. By dinner, I would somehow be the person who had dragged Mom's illness into Christmas. So I changed my plan. I would not confront Vanessa before the party. I would watch. I would listen. If Richard Hale really belonged to my memory of those years, maybe hearing him speak would place him. If CarePath language matched something from Mom's paperwork, there might be a harmless explanation. I wanted facts before emotion. That was new for me only in the sense that family had always made facts feel rude. The rest of the afternoon made my new plan harder than I expected. Vanessa kept finding reasons for me to work in the rooms farthest from where her guests would gather. She asked me to move the coat rack into the foyer, then organize bottles in the kitchen, then check the downstairs bathroom for hand towels. None of those jobs was unreasonable by itself. Together they formed a map. When I carried a tray of clean glasses toward the living room, Vanessa intercepted me at the doorway and told me to take them back to the kitchen. I said I was taking them to the bar. She said she would do it. When I asked why she needed my help, but kept sending me away from the room, her irritation finally showed. Because I need you helping, not getting pulled into CarePath talk. The words landed differently than her earlier remarks. Until then I could tell myself she simply liked controlling a room. This was not about napkins or chairs. She was drawing a boundary around information and placing me outside it before anyone arrived. I asked what she thought I was going to say. Her expression smoothed over. Nothing. That's the point. You don't know these people, and they don't need our family history. I thought about the card and Mom's notebook. Dad came through carrying a box of wine, heard only the end, and said, "Just help your sister tonight, Aaron." I nearly told him I had been helping since I walked through the door. Instead, I took the box and carried it to the kitchen. By late afternoon, the winter light had drained from the windows, and the house glowed with lamps, candles, and the white lights Vanessa had wrapped around the banister. I could hear her upstairs changing clothes, while Dad adjusted the thermostat for the third time. I stood alone in the kitchen, looking through the doorway toward the dining room where Richard Hale's place card waited beside Dad's. The name still bothered me. So did the way Vanessa had taken the guest sheet away, and the phrase, "preferred partners." By then, not asking questions no longer felt exactly like keeping the peace. It felt like giving other people control over what I was allowed to know. A little before 6:30, Vanessa came downstairs in a dark green dress and heels. She checked the flowers, candles, and drink station, then walked into the kitchen and placed a folded white apron on the counter directly in front of me. For a few seconds, I only stared at the apron. It was not one of Dad's old kitchen aprons or something Vanessa had grabbed because the caterer was short-handed. It was new, white, pressed flat, with a narrow waist tie and no logo. She had bought it for someone. Apparently that someone was me. Vanessa checked the time on her phone and said, "My VIP guests arrive at 7. Put on an apron and answer the door." She said it with the same tone she had used all day for candles, place cards, and ice buckets, as though my place in the evening had already been decided and I was simply another item that needed arranging. I looked at Dad. Some part of me still believed there had to be a line Vanessa could cross that would make him say enough. He was standing near the pantry, with a corkscrew in one hand. He looked from me to the apron, and instead of asking why his daughter was being dressed like hired help at her own family Christmas, his face hardened with impatience. "Don't ruin your sister's big night." Vanessa smirked, quick and almost private, then tapped the face of her phone. "Be at the door by 6:55. I tied the apron around my waist because taking it off and throwing it at her would have given her exactly the story she had been preparing all day. Aaron makes everything personal. Aaron cannot let Vanessa have one evening. Aaron turns Christmas into a grievance. I told myself I was choosing my moment, not accepting my place. The distinction felt thinner once I saw myself reflected in the dark kitchen window, wearing a black dress under a white apron, while Vanessa moved through the living room, greeting the caterer by name. At 6:52, she handed me a stack of coat tags and told me to take coats, point people toward drinks, and keep the entry clear. Dad adjusted a lamp and avoided looking at me. The house smelled of rosemary, warm pastry, and Vanessa's pine candle. From the foyer, I could see Richard Hale's place card near Dad's chair. I tried the name once more in my head and got only flashes. Fluorescent light, paper cups, Mom wrapped in a cardigan even though the room was warm. At exactly 6:55, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, silver hair damp with cold. He had one hand lifted as if he had expected to knock again. His eyes met mine, and the polite smile on his face disappeared. He did not merely hesitate. He froze. The memory landed for me a heartbeat later. A caregiver, support room 3 years earlier, bad coffee, a man whose wife had been declining faster than anyone had prepared him for. Richard Hale. Before I could say his name, his gaze moved from my face to the apron, then past me into the house. Dad had stepped into the foyer. Richard turned to him. "Excuse me, why is she standing here?" The question seemed to take Dad by surprise, but Vanessa appeared almost immediately, laughing too quickly as she came down the hall. She touched Richard's arm and said I liked helping, that I was family but not really involved in this world, and that he had caught them in the last 5 minutes of setup. Then she pulled him toward the living room with such practiced ease that anyone arriving 30 seconds later would have assumed nothing strange had happened. But something had. Until that moment, Vanessa had controlled the room because she controlled the introductions. Richard had walked through the door, carrying information she had not supplied him, and I could see that realization in the way she kept herself between us while asking about his drive and offering him a drink. The next guests arrived almost on time, and whatever private meaning Richard's reaction held was buried under coats, greetings, handshakes, and the first rush of the reception. Vanessa made sure I stayed busy. I took a wool coat from a board member, hung a red scarf carefully, carried a tray of wine and sparkling water into the living room, returned with empty glasses, and went back with small plates of crab cakes and mushroom tartlets. I served the people Vanessa had called her VIP guests, while Dad stood near the fireplace telling them how proud he was of her. No one else treated me badly. That almost made it worse. One woman thanked me and asked whether I worked with the caterer. Before I could answer, Vanessa called across the room. "That's my sister. She's just helping us tonight." The woman looked embarrassed. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. I kept moving because movement gave me an excuse to watch. Richard listened when Vanessa described CarePath's planned expansion, but his attention was not as easy as the others. Twice, I caught him looking toward me. The second time, I was setting down a tray near the bookcase, and he stepped away from the group. "I knew I recognized you," he said quietly. "You were with Elaine at that caregiver group." Hearing Mom's name from him made the room seem to narrow. I told him, yes, and suddenly the old image sharpened. Richard sitting across from us with his hands around a paper cup, while Mom asked questions because questions were how she fought fear. He glanced toward the living room before adding that Vanessa's materials had mentioned a younger daughter who handled most of the day-to-day care. He had not realized that daughter was me. I asked what he remembered about Mom. Richard took his time. "Elaine," he said, had once asked whether his family had been sent to the same placement people, the same home care people, and the same planning advisor. At the time, he had assumed she was comparing notes the way caregivers did. One name had stayed with him because his wife had used the service too. Harbor Home Support. I asked why Mom had been asking. He shook his head. I don't know, and I don't want to make it into more than it was. She asked me a question. That's all I know. His restraint made it more unsettling. He did not know about the Christmas card or MR in the notebook. He was simply remembering something that had happened independently of me. Before Vanessa reached us, Richard took a business card from his coat pocket and told me I could contact him if I remembered anything else from those years. Vanessa appeared beside us before I could ask anything else. Her smile remained in place, but her hand closed around the stem of her wineglass hard enough to whiten 2 knuckles. She told Richard she had promised him an introduction before one of the guests left, then told me the caterer needed help with the hot trays. Richard started to say something, but Vanessa had already turned him toward the other side of the room. I went back to the kitchen. A few minutes later, I passed the living room carrying appetizers and saw Richard speaking to Vanessa in a low voice. I could not hear them, only see that Vanessa was no longer smiling. Dad noticed too. He crossed the room and joined them, and the conversation ended almost immediately. Later, Vanessa found me alone near the pantry. She straightened a stack of napkins that did not need straightening and said, "Please don't drag Mom into tonight." I told her I had not. Richard had. Her eyes lifted to mine. For the first time all evening, she had no quick answer. Then someone called her from the dining room, and the polished version of my sister returned as if a switch had been thrown. The reception lasted until after 10. Richard did not speak to me alone again. Vanessa stayed close to him whenever she could, and Dad kept finding small reasons to send me toward the kitchen. I did what was asked, but by then the apron had stopped being the thing that bothered me. Richard had confirmed one simple fact. Mom had asked someone outside our family about repeated referrals. The card was no longer an isolated sentence. It belonged to a conversation. After the last guest left and Vanessa went upstairs, I untied the apron and folded it on the kitchen counter. Dad was collecting glasses in the living room. I went to the den, closed the door, and took out Mom's notebook and the old Christmas card. This time I did not stop at MR. I turned several pages past medication times, appointment notes, and grocery reminders. Beside a line in Mom's small handwriting, I saw a name Richard had spoken less than 4 hours earlier. Harbor Home Support. I turned another page. Harbor Home Support appeared again. Then again, several pages later. I sat down on the edge of Dad's old desk chair, with the card beside me and the notebook open across my knees. Whatever Mom had been asking 3 years ago, she had not asked it only once. The house was finally quiet, but I was more awake than I had been all day. I carried Mom's notebook upstairs to the guest room and sat cross-legged on the bed with the old Christmas card beside me. For the first time, I read the notebook as something other than a record of illness. Most of it was exactly what I remembered. Medication times, appointment changes, foods Mom could tolerate, little reminders in my handwriting like "Call oncology nurse and buy ginger tea." There were pages where my notes and hers overlapped so completely I could not tell who had written what without looking at the slant. Nothing about it resembled a secret file. That mattered. If Mom had been building some grand accusation, this was not how she had done it. The strange entries were buried between ordinary life. Harbor Home Support appeared beside an arrow, then an initial. A placement service appeared 3 pages later, followed by another pair of initials. A planning advisor Richard had mentioned showed up near a date, then again beside a name I did not recognize. Once I stopped looking at the pages one at a time, the repetition became visible. Whatever Mom had been tracking, she had been doing it inside the same notebook we used to remember pills and grocery lists. At first I made the most obvious assumption. The initials must belong to people Mom distrusted. MR had written the card, so maybe MR had once been part of the problem, and later admitted Mom had been right. Other initials sat near provider names in ways that looked almost like connections. DS beside the planning advisor. JL next to Harbor Home Support. CP, with an arrow toward the placement service. Seen that way, the notebook looked less like a pattern and more like a list of people and companies Mom had become suspicious of while she was sick. The thought hurt because Dad's voice came back immediately. Your mother was worried about everything near the end. I hated how easily the pages could be made to support him. Mom had good days and terrible ones. There had been afternoons when pain medication left her foggy enough to ask me the same question twice. There had been nights when a new symptom convinced her something catastrophic was happening. I knew those memories were real. I also knew Richard's memory was real. The two truths sat beside each other and refused to become a clean answer. Christmas morning did not offer much room for investigation. Dad wanted breakfast together. Vanessa came downstairs late, hair tied back, wearing a sweater instead of the green dress from the night before. Neither of them mentioned Richard's reaction. Dad opened gifts and kept conversation deliberately ordinary. Vanessa talked about the caterer, one donor's travel plans, and how relieved she was the reception had gone smoothly. I watched her over the rim of my coffee and wondered what counted as smooth in her mind. She had stopped me from talking to Richard twice, then told me not to drag Mom into the night after Richard had been the one to bring her up. I could have challenged her in front of Dad. I did not. I still had only fragments, and I was beginning to understand that Vanessa was very good at making fragments look like instability. If I wanted to know what Mom had been doing, I needed one thing I could verify without asking my sister to explain herself. By early afternoon, I sent Richard a short message thanking him for speaking with me and asking one narrow question. Did any of the initials DS, JL, or CP mean anything to him from the caregiver group? I did not send photos of the notebook. I did not mention suspicions. I did not ask whether he thought CarePath had done something wrong. Richard replied almost an hour later. DS meant nothing to him. CP could have been several people. JL, though, he thought he remembered. Janet, he wrote. Older woman, caring for her husband after a stroke. She came to the Thursday group a few times. That answer broke my theory in one clean place. Janet had not been a provider or advisor. She had been a caregiver. If JL was a caregiver, then the initials were not simply a list of people Mom thought were involved in something. I turned back to the notebook and looked at the arrows again. The pages had not changed. My interpretation had. I wrote Richard back, asking if he remembered Janet's last name. His response came more slowly this time. He said he was not sure, and then added something that changed the temperature of the exchange. Vanessa had reached out that morning. She had apparently wanted to apologize for the awkwardness at the party and explain that I had taken Mom's death very hard. Richard phrased it carefully. Vanessa had told him I sometimes read old notes as though they were unfinished business, because I never really stopped being Mom's caregiver after she died. He did not accuse Vanessa of anything, and he did not dismiss me. In fact, his caution was almost painfully polite. He said grief could make old details feel urgent, and he did not want to encourage me into conclusions he could not support. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Vanessa had not waited to see what I would do. She had moved first. She had taken the one person who had independently remembered Mom's question and placed a frame around me before I could ask him anything else. For a few minutes, I was furious enough to prove her point. I wanted to march downstairs, hold out my phone, and ask why she was discussing my grief with a man who had known me for less than a handful of meetings 3 years earlier. I imagined Dad stepping between us, Vanessa saying she was only protecting Richard from being dragged into family pain, me raising my voice, her becoming calmer. The whole scene assembled itself before I moved. That was when I understood the trap. If I acted from anger, the argument would no longer be about what Mom had written. It would be about whether I was emotional. Vanessa did not need to prove my interpretation wrong if she could make the interpretation itself look like a symptom. I put the phone down and did something that felt unnatural in my own family. I slowed down. I went back through the notebook and copied only what was physically there. I made a simple list on a legal pad. Provider name, initials beside it, arrow direction, date if there was one. No conclusions. Harbor Home Support appeared 4 times across several weeks. The placement service appeared with 3 different initials. The planning advisor appeared beside 2 of the same initials that showed up elsewhere. M.R. appeared more than once. The more carefully I copied, the less the pages looked like random suspicion, and the more they looked like Mom had been comparing something. But I still did not know what. That distinction mattered. Richard had already shown me how easy it would be to mistake one type of person for another. If I turned every unknown into evidence, Vanessa would be right about one thing. I would be reading what I wanted into the pages. The next problem was identifying M.R. The card gave me no last name beyond the initial. I searched my phone for old caregiver contacts and found almost nothing because I had deleted most group messages after Mom died. I checked an archived email account and found a thread with a subject line about meeting times from the support group. Most names meant nothing to me now, but one did. Monica Reeves. She had been a soft-spoken woman with cropped gray hair who cared for an older sister, not a spouse. I remembered her mainly because she always brought peppermint tea in a steel thermos, and because Mom liked her. The initials matched the card. More importantly, Monica was not a provider. She had been a caregiver too. I let the rest of Christmas Day pass without contacting anyone else. By the morning of December 26th, calling a near stranger about a dead woman's notebook still felt intrusive, so I messaged instead. I introduced myself, asked whether she remembered Elaine Mercer, and signed my full name. Monica answered within 20 minutes. Of course, she remembered Mom. She asked if Dad was all right, and said she had thought about us more than once over the years. I told her I had found old notes, and was trying to understand a few initials. Could I call? She said yes. Her voice was older than I remembered, but immediately familiar. I kept the conversation narrow. I read M.R., then J.L., then D.S. I expected her to tell me which service each person worked for. Instead, there was a pause long enough for me to hear a clock ticking somewhere on her end. Where did you get those? She asked. I told her they were in Mom's care notebook, written beside names like Harbor Home Support and other referral services. Monica went quiet again. When she spoke, her tone had changed. Those aren't the people your mother was afraid of. For a moment, I thought Monica had misunderstood me. I repeated that the initials were written beside provider names, sometimes with arrows between them. She said she understood. Then, she explained something so simple that I felt embarrassed I had not seen it. M.R. was Monica Reeves because Mom had been tracking Monica's family. J.L. was Janet and her husband. The other initials were not employees, advisors, or people Mom suspected of doing anything. They were families from the caregiver group. Elaine would ask where someone had been sent for placement help, home care support, or planning, then write the family's initials beside the route they described. Monica said Mom had started doing it after hearing the same names come up in conversations that were supposed to have nothing to do with one another. She wasn't collecting bad people, Monica told me. She was comparing where all of us were being sent. I looked down at my legal pad and felt the entire notebook change shape in my mind. The arrows no longer connected suspects. They connected families to services. Mom had not been asking, "Who is dangerous?" She had been asking, "Why are so many different people ending up in the same places?" I pulled the legal pad toward me and crossed out the word suspects I had written at the top the night before. Then I copied one of Mom's sequences exactly as she had drawn it. Initials, arrow, service category, another arrow. Read that way. The page looked almost embarrassingly ordinary. A sick woman trying to compare stories before fatigue or another appointment interrupted her. I asked Monica what had happened with her own family, careful not to turn her into an answer just because I finally understood the question. She had been caring for her older sister, whose mobility had declined after a series of falls. Their navigation contact had given them several categories to consider, and Monica remembered being told that the family remained free to choose. On paper, there had been options. In practice, the same placement service, the same home support company, and the same planning advisor kept appearing as the easiest or most trusted path. Harbor Home Support had been one of them. Monica had used some of the recommendations. Her sister's aid had been kind. One planner had actually helped them untangle a mess of bills. Nothing in Monica's story sounded like a horror story, and that was precisely why I listened harder. She was not saying they had been cheated. She was saying that Elaine had noticed how often independent guidance seemed to circle back to the same cluster. Monica remembered brushing it off at first, because when you are exhausted, a short list feels like mercy. Your mother kept asking whether a choice was still independent if every road sign pointed the same direction, she said. The sentence sat heavily between us. It was not proof, it was a question. But it was a question Monica remembered from before I ever opened the card. Then I finally told her about the Christmas card. There was a long silence. Monica admitted she had sent it. She had written, "You were right about the referrals," after another caregiver from the group mentioned being routed through the same sequence. By then, Mom was much sicker. Monica had meant to call, then kept putting it off because everyone was overwhelmed and no one wanted another problem to solve. She sounded ashamed, and I stopped her before she could turn the call into an apology to me. I did not need guilt from a woman who had been caring for someone of her own. What mattered was narrower. The card had not been written because Monica suddenly discovered a crime. It had been written because one more family had made Mom's pattern harder to dismiss. Monica could tell me what Mom had been comparing. She could not tell me what the pattern meant. When we hung up, I sat with the notebook open and forced myself not to race ahead. Vanessa had already given Richard a version of me in which grief turned old fragments into unfinished business. If I wanted to avoid becoming that version, I needed boundaries. I tore a clean page from Dad's legal pad and divided it into 3 columns. Known, inferred, unknown. Under known, I wrote only things I could support without interpretation. Mom had written several caregiver family initials beside repeated provider categories. Monica confirmed the initials represented families. Monica's family had received recommendations involving the same categories and at least one of the same services. Richard remembered Mom asking his family about the same placement, home care, and planning route. Under inferred, I wrote that Mom appeared to have been comparing referral paths because she suspected concentration. Under unknown, I wrote the questions I was most tempted to answer too quickly. Why did the same providers repeat? Did CarePath have any relationship with them? Were families told about those relationships at the moment choices were being made? Did Vanessa know any of this? I stopped there. 3 families were enough for a question. They were not enough for a verdict. That distinction changed the way I looked at the materials Vanessa had left around Dad's house. Before Christmas Eve, the folders and printed packets had been part of her scenery, no more meaningful to me than the white roses or place cards. Now I read only what was sitting in plain view. One expansion packet described CarePath's navigation model as independent and family-centered. Another page listed preferred partners by category. I did not need to search Vanessa's laptop or open anything private. The documents she had brought for donors were enough to show that Harbor Home Support still appeared in the same general cluster of services Mom had written about 3 years earlier, alongside a familiar placement category and planning support. That alone did not mean anything improper. Large organizations often reuse vendors they trust. Families might prefer providers with established relationships. The words on the page could support Vanessa's explanation just as easily as Mom's concern. Then I found the sponsor acknowledgements. They were not hidden. That mattered too. Near the back of a separate CarePath organizational packet was a list thanking companies and service organizations for annual sponsorship and training support. Some of the preferred providers appeared there. The language was bland and public, the kind of thing most people would skim past. What caught me was not the existence of sponsorship. It was the distance between that page and the pages telling families that navigation was independent. I remembered Monica saying that exhausted people experience a short list as mercy. If a family was told, "Here are trusted independent options," did they also understand in that moment that some of those preferred organizations financially supported CarePath through fixed annual sponsorships or training grants? Maybe they did. Maybe there were disclosures I had not seen. Maybe the support had no influence at all. I wrote every one of those possibilities under unknown. For the first time, the mystery stopped belonging only to Mom's final year. The same architecture she had been trying to understand still existed in Vanessa's current expansion materials. That did not make Vanessa guilty of anything. It did make my next question unavoidable. Mom could have been wrong about what the pattern meant, and still have been right that there was a pattern worth examining. Dad came into the dining room while I was comparing the packets and asked whether I wanted leftovers. I closed the notebook before he saw the page. Not because I was hiding evidence, but because I was not ready to let his old conclusion become the frame again. I told him I would eat later. He looked at the papers in front of me and hesitated, then went back to the kitchen without asking what I was doing. That small retreat told me nothing I could put in the known column, so I did not. Vanessa came down about 20 minutes later with her phone pressed to her ear. She finished the call, saw the CarePath packet beside me, and stopped. I expected irritation. Instead, she gave me the controlled expression she used when she wanted to make another person feel unreasonable before they had spoken. I did not mention Mom. I did not mention the card. I did not accuse CarePath of steering anyone. I asked one question. Why do the same preferred providers keep showing up in the referral routes? Her eyes sharpened. I tapped the packet. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm asking whether anyone has looked at how concentrated the recommendations are. Vanessa answered so quickly that there was no pause in which she could pretend the question was new. I already looked into that last spring. For a second, I thought I had caught Vanessa in a lie. Her answer had come too fast, too cleanly. But when I asked what she meant, she did not retreat. She pulled out the chair across from me and turned the CarePath packet so the preferred provider page faced us both. What followed was not the confession I had expected. It was an explanation, and the unsettling part was that much of it made sense. CarePath, she said, did not get paid every time a family chose Harbor Home Support or any other preferred provider. Some providers gave the nonprofit fixed annual sponsorship money or paid for training programs, but those payments did not rise or fall with referrals. Preferred partners were vetted for licensing, availability, complaint history, and whether they could handle the volume of families CarePath served. Families could choose someone else. The sponsorship relationships were listed in CarePath's organizational materials. Repeated names, she said, were what happened when a regional network found vendors it trusted and used them often. A few days earlier, I would have heard only Vanessa defending herself. Now I heard something more difficult. A plausible system. A nonprofit could receive fixed support from companies it also knew well. A family could remain free to choose while still being shown a shorter list of providers. The same names could repeat because those providers were reliable, not because anyone was buying access. Nothing in Mom's notebook disproved any of that. Nothing Monica had told me did either. My legal pad column still mattered, but the uncertainty had shifted. The question was no longer whether repetition alone proved something improper. It was whether families understood the relationships around those recommendations at the moment the recommendations carried the most weight. The structure could be lawful and still present a real transparency question. The two ideas were not mutually exclusive. I asked what she had looked into last spring. Vanessa kept one hand on the packet. The same concern you think you just discovered. When I asked her to be specific, she admitted that months earlier, during expansion planning, someone reviewing the program had questioned whether concentrating referrals among a small preferred group created an appearance problem. The issue was not whether CarePath was taking kickbacks. It was whether families understood, at the decision point, that some of the same providers being presented as trusted options also supported CarePath through fixed sponsorships and training grants. Vanessa said the question had been discussed precisely because the underlying relationships were permitted. The argument was about how prominently they needed to be surfaced. I asked what CarePath had done with the question. Vanessa said the concern had been reviewed internally. The answer she had received was that the sponsorships were fixed. The providers did not pay per referral. Families remained free to choose outside the network, and disclosure existed in organizational materials. She had accepted that answer. CarePath tracked outcomes and satisfaction, and the preferred partners performed well enough that she saw no reason to slow an expansion over what she considered a transparency issue that could be managed through better wording. The phrase better wording stayed with me, so I asked whether anything had changed. Vanessa said some language had been clarified. When I asked whether that meant the disclosure families saw at the point of recommendation, her expression tightened. Not every disclosure belongs in the first conversation. That was where her explanation stopped feeling complete. Vanessa kept returning to whether the relationship was permitted. Mom had been asking whether it was visible when a frightened family had to choose. I asked why. If she had already looked into referral concentration, she had acted so alarmed when Richard mentioned Mom at the party. Vanessa said she had seen exactly where it could go. Me turning 3 old caregiver stories into a case. I reminded her she had contacted Richard before I accused anyone of anything. She said she was protecting a donor from unresolved family grief, but when I asked why my grief needed explaining to him at all, she looked away. Then she changed the ground beneath the conversation. You want Mom to have been right. I told her that was not what I wanted. Yes, it is. Because if she was right, then all those awful months become something. She saw something everyone else missed. You were the daughter who stayed close enough to understand her. Dad and I become the people who failed her. It gives grief a shape. Vanessa's argument hurt because it reached a real place. Mom had not been lucid every hour of every day. There were mornings when she could compare appointment dates faster than I could, and nights when pain medication left her frightened or unable to hold a thread of conversation. Near the worst stretches, she sometimes lost her place and found it again minutes later. Loving her did not require me to erase that. If I turned every memory into perfect clarity because Dad and Vanessa had leaned too hard on the opposite version, I would be rewriting her too. Vanessa pressed the point. Mom had been sick, scared, and sometimes confused. A handful of repeated referrals did not make her an expert on nonprofit governance. CarePath had helped families, including ours, through decisions that would have overwhelmed us alone. I did not argue with the last sentence. That surprised her more than anger would have. I'm not trying to make Mom an expert, I said. I'm trying to understand why a question she asked 3 years ago is still a question your program had to review last spring. Vanessa's face hardened. Because large systems generate the same questions over and over. That doesn't mean every question is a scandal. She stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Before she walked away, she said something quieter. She told me I had no idea what it was like to build something useful and then watch people treat imperfection as proof that the whole thing was rotten. The line did not sound rehearsed. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I could hear the fear underneath her confidence. She believed CarePath helped people. She also believed momentum had value of its own. Every delay meant counties not launched, families not served, donors reconsidering. In that calculation, a concern that had not produced a clear finding became something to manage rather than something to reopen. That was when my objective changed. Until then, some part of me had still been trying to settle a private question. Was Mom right? Or had illness made her see intention where there was only repetition? But Vanessa's own explanation made that question too simple. Mom could have misunderstood the cause and still have noticed the pattern. Vanessa could have been right, that the sponsorships were lawful, and still have chosen not to look harder at whether independent meant the same thing to CarePath as it did to an exhausted family. I no longer needed to prove Mom had solved anything. I needed to know what my own family had known when she raised the concern, and what version of that history Vanessa was now using to sell the expansion. Vanessa had left several donor packets stacked at the end of the table. I did not touch her laptop or open any folder that was closed. I picked up the same expansion packet I had already been reading and started from the front, this time paying attention not to provider lists but to the family story woven through the pitch. CarePath's language emphasized trust, relief, and the moment when overwhelmed relatives could no longer tell which choice was best. There were short testimonials scattered between statistics. Most were anonymous, one was not. Thomas Mercer, family caregiver. My stomach tightened before I read the quotation beneath his name. Dad had apparently given Vanessa permission to use his experience with Mom as part of the expansion story. The line was only one sentence, polished enough to sound as if someone had edited it for a brochure. CarePath guided us when Elaine could no longer make clear decisions. I read it once, then again. Dad had spent the days since I arrived telling me Mom had been worried, sick, tired, confused. Now, I was looking at those same ideas, turned into fundraising language, under his own name. I still did not know what decision he had made 3 years earlier, or why he needed this version of Mom to be the official one. But for the first time, I stopped asking whether Dad truly believed she had been confused. I started wondering what that belief protected. I carried the expansion packet into the kitchen and found Dad at the sink. The Christmas decorations were still up, but the house no longer felt like Christmas. The ribbon Vanessa had tied around the banister looked too formal in daylight, and the stack of leftover party glasses beside Dad made the room feel like the morning after something larger than a reception. I set the packet on the table, with his quotation facing up. He did not ask what I wanted. He saw his own name, and sat down before I said anything. That reaction told me he knew exactly which conversation had finally reached him. I asked him what CarePath had actually done for us when Mom was sick. Not what the brochure said. Not what Vanessa told donors. What had Dad signed, paid for, or agreed to, that made him keep repeating that Mom could not make clear decisions? He rubbed both hands over his face and told me, first, that I was mixing different things together. Mom had still made her own medical decisions. He had never been her guardian, never signed away her right to consent to treatment, and never overruled her doctors on her behalf. The arrangement he was talking about had been outside the hospital. CarePath had connected him to a privately purchased navigation and home support package that bundled planning help, aid coordination, and provider recommendations. Dad had handled the bills and contracts because I was handling Mom. He had been the household payer. The agreement had been in his name. That distinction mattered, and I let him make it. I was not interested in accusing him of a legal authority he had never claimed. I asked the harder question instead. If Mom still had her own decision-making capacity, why had the family story become that CarePath guided us when Elaine could no longer make clear decisions? Dad stared at the quotation for a long time. Then he said, "Because there were days when she couldn't." I told him. I knew that. I had been there. I had held Mom's glass while she tried to remember whether she had already taken pain medication. I had watched her lose the thread of a conversation and cry, because she could feel herself losing it. I was not asking whether those days existed. I was asking whether they explained the specific objection she had made about the referral bundle. Dad's shoulders dropped. He stopped defending the sentence and started remembering the decision. The package had been presented as a way to reduce chaos. Instead of Dad calling half a dozen places, the navigation service would coordinate the process and point him toward vetted options. The trouble was that Mom noticed the supposedly independent choices kept returning to the same names, the same home support company, the same planning people, the same placement contacts. She had asked Dad why the list looked different at the top, but always narrowed toward the same people by the time someone recommended what to do next. When I asked what he had said to her, He looked at the table. I said we needed help. After another silence, Dad told me the truth without polishing it. Mom had wanted him to slow down and ask more questions. He was sleeping 4 hours a night, managing bills, schedules, transportation, insurance, and a house built around one sick person. I was with Mom most days and nights, and Vanessa came when she could. The people offering the package sounded certain. Mom sounded suspicious. Dad thought slowing down meant losing help, so he trusted the certainty and signed. He was not proud of it, and he had not wanted to hurt her. He had been exhausted enough to choose the answer that reduced chaos and frightened enough to call that answer responsible. Then I understood why every conversation about Mom's questions had ended with her confusion. If her concern had been only confusion, Dad had made a difficult decision in a terrible year. If her concern had been coherent, then his decision had included something else, refusing to listen because listening would have required backing away from the help he had already decided the family needed. I slid the packet toward him. And 3 years later, you let Vanessa use this. Dad admitted he had approved the testimonial. Vanessa had asked to use their family experience because donors responded to real stories, and he believed the sentence fairly compressed Mom's hardest weeks. The fear, the medication, the nights she lost track of time. He had not wanted to separate those days from the referral arguments. When I asked what Vanessa knew, he said she knew Mom had objected to the package, but did not think any of them understood she had been comparing our route with other families. I believed him about that. Even I had missed the pattern in an ordinary notebook for 3 years. But it did not restore his neutrality. He had known Mom questioned our own route, signed anyway, and later allowed her worst days to stand in for the entire period. Vanessa entered the kitchen while we were still talking. Dad looked relieved to see her, which told me he still thought she might translate the problem into something manageable. She read the packet on the table, understood immediately, and asked how long I planned to keep digging through things that had already happened. I told her Dad had just explained the agreement. Her first reaction was not denial. She said the arrangement had gotten us through a crisis. There had been aides when we needed aides, planning support when Dad could barely function, and people who answered the phone when the rest of us did not know whom to call. She asked whether I was prepared to erase all of that because Mom disliked how the options were presented. Dad joined her there. We made the best decision we could at the time. It was his defense, and for the first time I heard exactly what it was defending. Not whether the provider cluster had been perfect. Not whether Mom had been wrong. The right to stop examining a decision once it had helped us survive. I told them I was not arguing that the care had been useless. Monica had said some of the same services helped her family too. My question was whether usefulness placed the structure above scrutiny. Vanessa warned that reopening an unresolved concern could damage work, helping people now, while Dad returned to the fact that none of them had known Mom was comparing multiple families. They had reached the same defense from different directions. He needed the old decision to remain reasonable under pressure, and she needed the current system to remain useful enough not to slow. Both positions required treating Mom's question as something the family had already earned the right to move past. That was when I knew another conversation in Dad's kitchen would not answer anything. Every fact I brought inside the house would be filtered through what the 3 of us stood to lose. I did not need Dad to admit Mom was right. I did not need Vanessa to admit her program was wrong. I needed one person whose own records could either match Mom's comparison or fail to match it. I went upstairs with my phone and Mom's legal pad summary. Richard had already remembered the categories, but memory was not enough. I sent him a message that was deliberately narrower than everything happening in the kitchen below. I asked whether he still had any paperwork from the period when his wife needed care. If he did, could he check only 3 things? The placement recommendation, the home support recommendation, and the planning advisor. I did not send Mom's notebook. I did not tell him what answer I hoped to find. I did not ask him to believe Elaine. I wrote, "If your records don't match, tell me that too." For the first time since I found the Christmas card, The question had left my family without becoming an accusation. That scared me more than any argument with Vanessa had. Inside Dad's house, we could still decide a subject was too painful and stop speaking. Once another person checked his own records, the answer would exist whether any of us liked it or not. Richard did not reply right away. An hour passed, then another. Downstairs, I heard Vanessa taking calls behind the closed den door and Dad moving around the kitchen as though enough small household noises could restore the week we had been having before I opened Mom's notebook. I kept my phone beside me and did not send a second message. Just after 6, it rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, he did not begin with an explanation. His voice was low and controlled. "I need to show you something before Vanessa hears about it." Richard asked me to meet him the next morning. He did not want to forward anything before we had looked at it together, and after the way Vanessa had already tried to frame our conversations, I understood why. We met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop a few miles from Dad's house. Richard arrived carrying a thin accordion folder that looked as ordinary as Mom's notebook had. That detail steadied me. Nothing about the past few days had come from a locked safe or a secret recording. It had come from paperwork tired families had once shoved into drawers because they were trying to survive. Richard opened the folder and laid out 3 documents from the period when his wife needed increasing support. One was a navigation summary describing CarePath's service as independent and family-centered. Another listed a placement contact and harbor home support among the recommended options. A third named the planning advisor Mom had written beside several families' initials. The categories matched the 3 I had asked him to check. More important, the documents showed the same narrowing pattern Mom had drawn with arrows. Several apparent choices at the beginning, then the same small group of preferred names appearing when a decision had to be made. Richard had also found an organizational brochure from that year. It thanked Harbor Home Support and 2 other preferred providers for annual sponsorship and training support, but that relationship did not appear on the recommendation sheet his family had been using at the moment they chose. He tapped the papers and said he still was not calling it fraud. I told him I was not either. The sponsorship could have been completely lawful. The providers could have been excellent. His wife might have received exactly the care she needed. What bothered him was more specific. During the weeks when his family was exhausted and frightened, independent navigation had sounded like the people guiding them had no relationship worth considering with the companies being recommended. The sponsorship information existed somewhere, but not where he remembered needing it. Looking at the pages now, he said he would have asked different questions if he had understood the relationship then. That was the first time someone outside our family changed his mind, because of his own records rather than anything Mom or I had said. Richard did not need Elaine's notebook to tell him what happened to his wife. He had dates, recommendations, and the language CarePath had given him. The pattern no longer depended on whether Dad thought Mom had been confused or whether Vanessa thought grief had made me suspicious. It existed in another family's file. Only after Richard had finished explaining his papers did I tell him what I knew. I kept it as narrow as I had promised myself. I explained that Monica had confirmed Mom's initials represented families, not suspects. I described the 3-family comparison without giving him names he did not need. I told him Vanessa had admitted referral concentration and decision point disclosure had already been questioned during expansion planning, and that she had accepted an internal explanation rather than slowing the launch. Finally, I showed him the line from Dad's testimonial. CarePath guided us when Elaine could no longer make clear decisions. I told him the boundary once. I could not say the pattern proved illegal payments, harmful referrals, or even that Mom had understood its cause. What I could say was that she had noticed the concentration across families, and that a similar structure still existed 3 years later. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he gathered the papers into a square stack, but did not put them away. He said the question for him was no longer whether Elaine had been right about everything. It was whether he was comfortable funding a larger version of a system whose independence language he now understood differently. His pledge was supposed to anchor CarePath's next expansion phase. He could not tell the nonprofit what to do, and he had no intention of pretending he could. But he could decide what his own money supported. By the time we left the coffee shop, Richard had made that decision. He would pause his anchor pledge until CarePath's referral relationships and decision point disclosures were independently reviewed. He said he would explain his concern using his own family's records, not Mom's notebook. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. If Vanessa accused me of inventing a scandal, Richard's decision would still have a basis that existed before Christmas. If Dad asked me to put Mom back in the box marked confused, Richard's paperwork would not disappear. The consequence arrived faster than I was emotionally prepared for. Richard contacted CarePath that afternoon. He did not announce wrongdoing. He did not demand anyone be fired. He simply withdrew the pledge from the upcoming launch budget pending review. Because Vanessa had built the timing of the expansion around that anchor commitment, the next phase no longer had the funding she had promised would be in place. By evening, 2 other backers who had been waiting on Richard's commitment decided to hold theirs as well, until the disclosure question was clarified. I learned this from Vanessa, not Richard. She came into Dad's dining room with her phone in her hand, and a look I had never seen on her before. She was not shouting. Vanessa almost never shouted when she was frightened. She became precise. She told me Richard had paused his pledge, that other commitments were now on hold, and that people who had been discussing launch dates were suddenly asking for documentation. Then she asked me exactly what I had told him. I repeated the same boundaries I had used with Richard. I said I had not accused CarePath of a crime. I had told him about Mom's comparison, Monica's explanation, Vanessa's admission that the concentration concern had been raised before, and Dad's testimonial. Richard had checked his own records and made his own decision. Vanessa seized on the notebook first, calling it fragmented context from a dying woman. I reminded her that Richard's decision rested on his own files, so she pivoted to proportionality. 3 families were not a system-wide sample, a disclosure question was not corruption, and an expansion serving real people should not be derailed by an unresolved pattern. If backers asked why a family member had raised the issue, she said she would explain that I had been Mom's primary hands-on caregiver and was still emotionally tied to those years. She did not deny the notebook or Mom's questions. She moved the fight to whether my judgment should carry weight. Dad joined us before dinner and asked me to call Richard back. "Retract what you can," he said, "before a question becomes an accusation." I told him the question had already left the house, and I had not turned it into an accusation. Richard had read his own documents. An independent review could find that CarePath's disclosures were adequate. It could find that changes were needed. Either result would be more real than another argument at the kitchen table. Dad looked toward Vanessa. She had been scrolling through messages, but now she set the phone down. For the first time, she acknowledged something I had not expected her to say aloud. The operational review was going to continue whether I cooperated or not. Richard's records existed. The funding pause existed. CarePath would have to answer the disclosure question on its own merits. Then she told me there was a second problem. Her expansion materials had used our family as part of her credibility story. Dad's testimonial said CarePath guided us when Mom could no longer make clear decisions. If I now told donors that Mom had actually raised a coherent version of the same concern CarePath later encountered, Vanessa could look as though she had built her professional story by dismissing a warning inside her own family. That was separate from whether the referral structure passed review. Vanessa's voice softened, which made what came next feel more dangerous than anger. She said there was still a way to keep the family history issue from becoming a separate credibility crisis for her. The review could continue. Richard could keep his pledge paused. Nobody had to pretend the independent records did not exist. The family only needed to clarify what we had believed at the time. Dad did not look at me. Vanessa did. Mom was confused near the end, she said. None of us ever believed there was really a pattern. For several seconds after Vanessa said it, nobody moved. The sentence sounded almost harmless in the dining room. Mom was confused near the end. None of us ever believed there was really a pattern. Both halves contained pieces of truth, arranged to do more work than truth should have been asked to do. Mom had been confused on some days. 3 years ago, I had not known she was comparing multiple families. Dad had not known how far she had taken the comparison. Vanessa could say the same. But that was not what she was asking me to confirm. She wanted one sentence to turn uncertainty into dismissal. If I repeated it, donors could hear that Elaine's questions had never been treated as credible inside her own family, which would help Vanessa argue she had not ignored a warning she should have recognized. I asked exactly what they wanted from me. Vanessa said there would be a short clarification conversation with several backers, separate from the operational review already being arranged. Nobody was asking me to withdraw Richard's records, and nobody could make the funding pause disappear by changing a family story. What they needed, she said, was context. Dad finally looked up and added that people were beginning to connect his testimonial, Mom's notes, and Vanessa's role as though the three of them formed a deliberate chain. He wanted the backers to understand how chaotic Mom's final months had actually been. That was the price of peace now. Not silence. My voice. For most of my life, keeping peace in our family had meant absorbing something small enough that objecting looked worse than accepting it. Move the table. Sit somewhere else. Help your sister. Put on the apron. None of those choices had required me to say something I believed was false. This did. Vanessa was not asking me to forgive her. She was asking me to lend my credibility to a version of Mom that would make Vanessa's own decisions easier to defend. She must have seen that in my face because she changed tactics. She stopped talking about herself and talked about families CarePath had helped. The next expansion phase, she said, was supposed to bring free navigation into 2 counties, where waiting lists were already long. Delays had consequences too. She had no proof that any provider had bought referrals. Neither did I. An independent review might conclude the disclosures had been adequate, perhaps with recommendations for clearer language. Was I willing to let useful work be damaged because Mom had started a theory she never completed? The question landed because I could not dismiss it as manipulation. I had already heard Monica say some of the recommended services had helped her sister. Our own family had received real help. Vanessa had built her defense around facts that made the choice harder, not easier. I could not tell myself I was simply protecting Mom from villains. There were no clean sides left. If I exaggerated the evidence, I could hurt people for the sake of a story I wanted to believe. If I erased the evidence, I would be doing the same thing Dad and Vanessa had done from the opposite direction. I told them I needed time. Upstairs, I closed the guest room door and put Mom's notebook on the bed. I did not reread every page. I did not need another round of clues. The mystery had already reached its limit. What I needed was to decide what I could say without borrowing certainty from either side. I took the legal pad I had been using and wrote 3 sentences. I cannot prove CarePath or any provider committed wrongdoing. Mom had confused days. Mom also asked the same referral question coherently across time and to people outside our family. Then I remembered one afternoon 3 years earlier that had seemed too ordinary to matter. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table in a blue cardigan, a heating pad behind her back, 2 sheets of paper spread beside a mug of tea she had forgotten to drink. It had been a good day, not a miraculous day. She was still sick, still tired, still pausing to breathe through pain. But her voice was calm. She had drawn 2 lines with her finger, one for our family and one for another caregiver from the group, and pointed out how both paths started with different lists and ended with the same home support company and the same planning advisor. I had been trying to get her to eat toast. I remember telling her that maybe those companies were simply the best ones available. She had nodded and said, "That could be true." Then she asked why nobody just said, plainly, how the relationships worked. What mattered about that memory was not that Mom had been right. It was that she had been reasoning. She had allowed for an innocent explanation. She had asked a specific question. Confusion on another night did not reach backward through time and erase that afternoon. When I came downstairs, Dad was alone in the kitchen. Vanessa had gone into the den for another call. I told him I would not say the sentence as written. He asked why I had to make the distinction public when I could simply say Mom had been confused near the end, which was true. I told him because the sentence did not stop there. The second half said none of us ever believed there was really a pattern. That was no longer true for me. More importantly, it suggested Mom's questions had never deserved to be separated from her worst days. Dad sat at the table with both hands around a coffee mug he was not drinking from. For a while, he repeated the same defense he had used before. They had made the best decision they could at the time. Then, something in him shifted. Maybe he was too tired to keep pretending this was only about Vanessa. He said that if I rejected the family version in front of backers, people would look back at his decision too. They would see that Mom had objected to the navigation package while he was paying for it, and that listening to her would have meant admitting he might need to stop, cancel, or rethink something he had already defended. He said quietly, "I don't want to be remembered as the husband who decided his wife was confused because it was easier." It was the first honest sentence he had given me about his fear. I sat across from him. I told him I did not know how other people would remember him. I knew he had been exhausted. I knew he had been frightened. I knew the package had helped us. I also knew he had chosen certainty when Mom asked him to slow down. All of those things could be true at once. If he believed his decision had been justified, he could explain it in his own name, but I would not lend him mine. Dad looked older than he had at Christmas dinner. He did not argue. That was almost worse. For years I had treated him like the referee, whose version of events had to be softened so the family could keep functioning. Now he was finally standing inside the conflict instead of above it. Vanessa came back in and asked whether I had decided. I told her I would participate in the clarification conversation. Her shoulders loosened immediately. She asked if that meant I understood what was at stake. I said I understood exactly what was at stake. She began explaining how the call would work, who would be present, and why it was important to keep the operational review separate from family history. I let her talk. I did not tell her what I planned to say. When she repeated that the purpose was simply to give context, I said I would give context. The call was set for the following morning. I barely slept. Not because I was still deciding, but because the decision had already been made, and now I had to live inside it. By morning, Dad had cleared the dining table except for his laptop, Vanessa's notes, and 3 coffee cups. The Christmas tree lights were still on in the next room, though daylight had filled the windows. Richard would join remotely with the other backers. The operational review would continue regardless of what happened in this conversation. I walked into the dining room and took the chair opposite Vanessa. She looked at me, saw that I had shown up, and for the first time since Richard pulled his anchor pledge, she relaxed. Vanessa's relief lasted until the first backer asked me why I had agreed to join the call. The question came less than a minute after everyone connected. Vanessa started to answer for me. I stopped her. I said I was there because our family history had been used in CarePath's expansion materials, and if that history was now part of the discussion, I wanted my own words attached to it. I could see Vanessa's expression change before she looked down at her notes. Dad sat beside the laptop with both hands folded tightly in front of him. Richard's face occupied one square on the screen. He looked like a man waiting to hear whether I would say more than the facts could carry. So, I began with the limit. I was not asking anyone to treat Mom's notebook as an audit or claiming that CarePath had committed a crime. What I could verify was narrower. Mom had compared referral paths from several families. Monica Reeves confirmed what the initials meant. Richard remembered Mom asking his family about the same placement, home, care, and planning route. And his old records later showed those categories narrowing toward the same preferred cluster. I added that some of those preferred providers also supported CarePath through fixed annual sponsorship or training grants. The issue was not that the grants themselves proved wrongdoing. It was that, in the old materials Richard kept, and the current materials I had seen, that relationship was not clearly surfaced beside the recommendation at the decision point. Vanessa had already admitted a similar concentration, and disclosure question was raised during expansion planning the previous spring, and that she chose to keep the expansion moving after accepting the internal explanation. The room stayed still. One of the backers asked whether Dad had known about Mom's concern at the time. I looked at him before I answered. Dad could have spoken for himself, but he did not. I said he had known she objected to the referral bundle because the supposedly independent options kept narrowing toward the same names. He had still paid for the non-medical navigation and home support package because the family needed help and because he trusted the professionals presenting it. That decision had helped us in real ways. It had also become part of the family story Vanessa later used to describe CarePath as the organization that guided us when Mom could no longer make clear decisions. Vanessa finally interrupted, not angrily, carefully. She said that was exactly why context mattered. Mom had been very sick. There had been days when she was frightened, exhausted, medicated, and confused. Nobody on the call disputed that. Then Vanessa turned to me and asked whether I would at least confirm that much. Yes, I said. She had confused days. Her shoulders eased by a fraction. Then someone asked whether those confused days explained the referral concerns. That was the sentence Vanessa had brought me into the room to answer. I looked at Dad, then at my sister. No, I won't say that about her. Vanessa's face went blank. I explained that Mom's confusion was real, but it did not erase every coherent question she had asked on other days. I had personally watched her compare two referral paths calmly and allow for an innocent explanation. She had asked the same basic question over time, and to people outside our family. I could not truthfully say, "We never believed there was really a pattern," because I believed there was a pattern now. I did not know what it ultimately meant. That was precisely why an independent review existed. Uncertainty was not the same thing as madness, and I was not willing to use Mom's worst days to make everyone else's choices easier to defend. Nobody applauded. The point was not to win the room. The point was that Vanessa could no longer tell people I had accused CarePath of a crime and then use my silence as proof that Mom's concern had never been coherent. Richard spoke only after I finished. He kept his part as narrow as I had kept mine. He confirmed that Elaine had asked him about the repeated referral route 3 years earlier, and that his own family's records later showed the same placement, home support, and planning categories, converging on the same preferred cluster. He said his decision to pause his pledge came from his own files, and from how he now understood the independence language he had relied on. He did not say Mom had uncovered fraud. He did not say Vanessa had knowingly harmed anyone. He simply made it impossible to pretend the entire concern had been invented by a grieving daughter during Christmas week. By the end of the call, nothing dramatic happened in the way Vanessa had feared and perhaps secretly hoped. No one fired her on the spot. No one declared CarePath corrupt. The operational review remained open. Richard's anchor pledge remained withdrawn. The other backers who had put their commitments on hold kept them there until the referral relationships and decision point disclosures could be examined independently. Without the anchor pledge, the next phase launch Vanessa had promised could not move on the schedule she had built around it. That consequence belonged to the review, not to my refusal to call Mom confused. But something else had changed for Vanessa. Before Christmas, she could present our family story as a clean example of CarePath bringing order to chaos. After the call, that story had edges she could no longer sand down. The backers knew Mom had raised a related concern. They knew Dad had dismissed it, while already committed to the household arrangement. They knew Vanessa herself had later encountered a similar disclosure question and chosen not to slow the expansion. None of those facts proved corruption. Together, they made certainty harder to sell. When the call ended, Vanessa closed her laptop and stared at the dark screen. She did not accuse me of destroying her career. Her career was not destroyed. Her expansion was delayed. Her credibility had taken a hit. The program would have to answer questions she had decided were manageable without outside scrutiny. That was consequence enough. After the call, Dad waited until Vanessa went upstairs before saying he did not want this to be the thing that broke the family apart. On Christmas Eve, that sentence would have sent me searching for the compromise that hurt me least. Instead, I remembered the apron on the counter, my place at the door, and Dad telling me not to ruin Vanessa's big night. Then he had asked me to stand where Vanessa needed me. Now he had asked me to say what Vanessa needed. I told him that was the part I was done with. He said he had only ever wanted to keep the family together. I know, I said, but keeping us together can't mean one person always has to stand in the convenient place. He looked toward the stairs. I did not ask him to choose between his daughters. I did not ask him to confess that Mom had been right about everything. I only refused to let his need for peace decide what I was allowed to remember. If he wanted to explain why he had made the choice he made 3 years earlier, he could. I would not soften it for him. If Vanessa wanted to defend her decision to keep the expansion moving after the disclosure concern was raised, she could do that too. I would not call either of them monsters. I also would not call Mom confused, just because that made their stories cleaner. There was no reconciliation before I left Dad's house. Vanessa and I said goodbye without hugging. Dad carried my bag to the car and stood in the driveway, as if there must still be one sentence that could fix everything if he found it fast enough. He never found one. Before I left, I went back to the den. I put Monica's Christmas card inside Mom's blue notebook and carried both downstairs. Dad saw them in my hands, but did not tell me to put them back. I did not take them as evidence for another fight. I took them because for 3 years, we had treated Mom's unanswered questions as something embarrassing that belonged in a cabinet. They did not need to become accusations. They did not even need to become answers. They only needed to stop being called confusion so the rest of us could stay comfortable.